What is it that makes a horror game truly terrifying? Is it the dark, cramped environments that restrict both your visibility and your movement? Could it be the suspense that builds up and evolves into a sense of dread as a threat finally presents itself? Or is it the monsters that make you feel totally powerless and vulnerable? In truth, it is all of these things and more. These elements will likely succeed in making a player that is alone in their dark room feel fear. But how can video games create and sustain fear when we introduce 2 or 3 of your friends into the scenario? This question is not as simple to answer, because a game that is scary when played alone can quickly become laughable when you have a friend next to you. Just look at some of the lower quality multiplayer horror games on Steam, such as Devour or Signs of Silence. These games might startle you and your friends on a first playthrough, but once you have a general idea of how the game works, the fear wanes and you are left with the tedium of beating the game. The gameplay becomes formulaic. You all know what it is that you must do, and you should know how to counter the enemies as a team. To be successful in its execution, a multiplayer horror game needs to not only master the basics, but make the necessary innovations to make multiple people feel fear at the same time. It isn't enough to have 4 people see a strange face in the dark, or hear the thumping of footsteps on the floor above. It can be these things, but it needs to be more. The game must take all of the aforementioned elements that make a game scary, then it must synthesize them and exert them in a way that can affect multiple people at once, and on their own. Creating a truly effective multiplayer horror game is clearly no easy feat, but somehow, the developer behind Lethal Company pulled it off. Now, I'm sure there are people that would argue that Lethal Company is not a horror game, and it is merely a space exploration game where you can visit exotic planets and get rich with your friends. But these are the kind of people who would call the invasion of Vietnam a fun holiday. Those same people clearly haven't been the last one left alive when there's only 1 day left to meet quota, contemplating whether they would rather face the abominations of the moon or be launched into the quiet abyss of space. Essentially, Lethal Company is a game where a corporation with no regard for the lives of its employees sends you and up to 3 of your friends on expeditions with the sole purpose of retrieving junk for profit. Now, I don't care enough to talk about the lore or the basic theme, but I do want to talk about the various systems and mechanics that work together to fill the players with dread. Alone or with friends, you must visit any of the 9 alien moons and bring back enough exotic loot over a 3-day period in order to meet quota. If you fail to meet this quota, you will be jettisoned from your ship and forced to start over, retaining none of your worldly possessions. Assuming that you make enough to meet quota, you can then use the money that you earn to buy tools and upgrades that might prove useful. These tools include everything from a flashlight to a stun grenade to a romantic table. Each time that you reach a quota, it will increase, but your time to meet it will remain the same. This means that you are forced to resort to riskier tactics as the game goes on, or else you will fail. If your team dies on a moon, you will lose all of your collected scrap and whatever gear you were carrying, which makes it even more difficult to meet quota. This cycle of landing on moons, collecting loot and selling it repeats indefinitely, with the quota climbing until it's impossible to reach. The moons vary in both risk and reward. The first 5 moons are free to visit, with 3 of the more difficult moons costing hundreds of dollars. While each moon has a set difficulty, the gameplay becomes even more dynamic due to the weather effects, which can drastically impact how a mission plays out. But what does a typical mission look like? In truth, there is no such thing as a typical mission. In essence, you will land on the moon at 8 AM, search the planet for the facility that is home to all of the loot, and descend into its bowels in the hopes that you find your fortune. The buildings are also home to all that is dangerous, and the players must work effectively as a team if they want to survive and retrieve enough loot to make their landing worthwhile. Each player can hold only 4 items, and each item has a specific weight to it. As your weight increases, your movement becomes slower, and your stamina bar gets smaller. This is a near perfect system, because the more fortunate you are in finding loot, the harder it becomes to run from threats. The game basically punishes you for success, and forces the player to contemplate dropping their loot in order to save their own hide, As if the weight of items didn't complicate things enough, but some items need to be held in both hands, which limits your ability to use tools and interact with the environment. This makes teamwork a necessity. The best strategy is to dump all of your loot at the main entrance, and have a teammate carry the goods to and from the ship like a mule. At the same time, a player should be taking advantage of the ship's computer in order to open doors and disable traps, but this limits the amount of players that are actually exploring the facility to just 1 or 2. One of Lethal Company's greatest strengths is its ability to isolate players in a multiplayer game, even in such a fundamental way as group dynamics. Another way that it does this is through the use of proximity chat, which should always be a staple of multiplayer horror. Hearing your friend's voice get quieter and quieter as you split up never fails to unnerve me. As you both explore different paths, the weight of being alone in a hostile environment slowly sets in, but it isn't just effective in building tension, but also in amplifying dread. Hearing your friend's muffled screams as they are suffocated by a bug gets your adrenaline pumping as you try desperately to save their life, though I will admit that it's also quite funny. So are the fading screams of your teammate as they run away from an unseen threat. The core strength of proximity chat is the ambiguity. After splitting up, you no longer know if your teammates are alive or dead. You might blindly be looting an engine room, oblivious to the fact that you're the last person alive. There is of course a walkie-talkie, but it takes up one of your valuable inventory slots, so it's not always a luxury that you can afford. The driving force behind Lethal Company's horror is the stakes. In Phasmophobia, even if you die and lose some gear, you likely have hundreds of dollars and a stockpile of gear to fall back on. If your team dies in Lethal Company, you will lose all of the gear you carried, as well as any scrap that you had collected. This is not like horror games where death is meaningless, and you simply return to an older save. Dying on day 1 forces you to resort to riskier strategies in the days that follow, making it even more difficult to meet quota. As you know, failing to meet quota forces you to start back from square one, much like a roguelike. All of your progress is lost, save for some data on the ship's computer. While it is the high stakes that make the game so exhilarating, it is the atmosphere and horrors of the moon that make it such a terrifying experience. Stepping foot into the complex, you're met with dark hallways, stairways descending impossibly low, flickering lights, and creaky doors. The overlapping sounds of the footsteps of both you and your teammates invokes paranoia, as it is hard to tell what sounds are being produced by your friend, or by something else. Before I dive deeper into something else, I want to briefly explain the role that time plays. We know already about the deadline, which is one thing, but the time during each mission is a different beast. We land on the moon at 8 AM. We have until midnight to return to the ship, or else it will leave without us, which effectively counts as a death. This means that you can't really afford to play the game safe. The clock is working against you. This works in tandem with the deadline, because if you are struggling to meet it, you might have to make a second run through the facility before midnight, which will be more rushed than the first, and subsequently more dangerous. The final layer is the nighttime. After 6 PM, enemies begin to spawn outside, making the journey back to the ship a nightmare. But what are these enemies? These are usually the most important part of a horror game, because they are what promise to rip the life from your body should you allow them to get close enough. I'm going to break the enemies down into 3 categories: basic enemies, outdoor enemies, and special enemies, with the latter being the most terrifying. The first of the basic variety is the beloved hoarding bug, which is not hostile but is perfectly capable of killing you if you provoke it. This alien bug will grab loot from around the map and begin hoarding it, or simply follow you around. If you try to take some of its valuables, it may begin flying and turn hostile. They can be destroyed in 3 to 4 hits with a shovel, but they can very easily kill you first. The next enemy is one of the most annoying to deal with, which is the snare flea. These disgusting creatures look like a weird, fleshy centipede, and have a habit of hiding on the ceiling or around corners. They don't attack in the traditional sense, but if you get close enough or walk under them, they will latch onto your head, suffocating you slowly. The only ways to counter this is to have another player hit you with a shovel or to quickly exit the building. The snare flea completely restricts your vision and even muffles your voice, so by the time they are wrapped around your helmet, it is usually too late. The dread felt by your team as you all scramble to save the snared player never ceases to make me laugh. One of the more manageable basic enemies is the Hygridir, which takes the form of a large blue blob. It moves very slowly, but will instantly kill any player that comes into contact with it. They have a habit of blocking pathways, forcing you to jump over them in order to survive. While they are nothing special on their own, they can quickly complicate scenarios where there are multiple enemies. The most concerning of the basic aliens is the bunker spider, which will top the list of fearsome foes for those with arachnophobia. They are large, brown spiders that act how you would suspect. They stick to walls and wait for their prey to walk into their webs, but are perfectly capable of chasing after you if you manage to escape. Their feet rattling against the metal floor is unsettling and can lead to you confusing them with other monsters. The last of the basic variety is the spore lizard, which above all else is gross looking. I hate the way that its mouth opens, revealing its hollow insides. Despite its appearance, it is virtually harmless and seeks only to be left alone. It can spray a purple mist that makes it hard to see, or give you a bite if you get close enough, but it genuinely is quite harmless on its own. Outdoor enemies are split again into two categories: those that spawn in day and those that spawn at night. During the day, there are roaming locusts, which are scannable swarms of locusts that disperse if you get close enough. Their far more dangerous cousin is the circuit bee, which again moves in swarms, can quickly kill you if you try to loot their hive. Unfortunately, their hive is worth a lot, and can be the difference between meeting quota or failing. In desperate times, you can have one player lure the bees away while another grabs the hive. Just be sure not to lure them back to the ship. Then there are the manticoils, which are difficult to describe. They are birds with 4 wings and are completely harmless, but I have seen them defy physics and push through the ground, so their capabilities are beyond our understanding at this point. Their description in the bestiary says that they can transmit rabies, rubenchloria, and the pit virus, but fortunately we typically don't live long enough to face the consequences. Another bird is the baboon hawk, which I hesitate to call a bird. Sure, they have hawk in their name and they can fly, but look at that thing. They have a thick, protruding skull that they will use to bash you with, but only if they think they can take you. Baboon hawks attack only when their group is equal to or greater than the number of players. I have read that they might back down if you yell at them, but I have experienced mixed results with testing this theory. After a successful haul, you might find yourself slowly trekking toward the ship, only to watch the ground around you begin to rumble, before being swallowed whole by a beast from beneath the earth. This would be an earth leviathan, which can result in an instant loss of life and loot. If you are light enough and react quickly, you can narrowly avoid the leviathan's jaws, but it will swallow any loot you drop in order to do so. As night falls, the moons will become home to even more deadly creatures, the first of which is the eyeless dog, which can be a nightmare to deal with. They're blind, so they react to sound, but once they hear you, it's virtually over. You can kite their attacks if you are lucky, but it becomes very difficult to escape once they are in pursuit. To make matters worse, they can even chase you into the ship and kill you. If this wasn't enough, there is also an enemy called the Forest Keeper, whose pounding footsteps can be heard from anywhere on the moon's surface. They look like a scared child's drawing of an ant, and walk menacingly toward you as they see you. Due to their size, they have no problem catching up to you if you are carrying loot, and will grab you with one arm, staring at you once more before swallowing you whole. If there is anything to take away from my descriptions of the nighttime enemies, it should be that the game really does punish success, as the added weight from the valuables in your inventory makes it almost impossible to evade these creatures. While the enemies I have mentioned so far can certainly end your mission early, they are not responsible for the total terror experienced by players. It is the special enemies that make this game such a special title. They operate in unique ways, and each completely changes the way that you approach any given landing. First, we have the Thumper. During our first encounter with this thing, My friends and I stared in confusion as it wandered aimlessly down the hall, only for it to turn and charge towards us, turning our party of 4 into a party of 3. According to the bestiary, this beast must eat both of its legs in order to escape the shell of their hatched egg, which is why they drag themselves around with those elongated arms. In appearance, they look to have the body of some mutated lizard, but have a head that can be compared only to a shark. If that wasn't bad enough, they have an additional 3 mouths on the side of its head, which expand as they scream at you, showing off their teeth in one final demonstration before charging right at you. You cannot outrun a thumper in a straight line, as they sprint at a speed beyond your capabilities. Luckily, turning will slow them down, so with a head start and enough corners, you might just be able to escape. Due to the mouths taking the place of ears, these enemies are unable to hear, which makes them avoidable, so long as you stay out of their line of sight. The next special enemy is the Coilhead. Now there are nerds out there that are going to instantly compare this to that one SCP whose name I refuse to look up, but I don't think that the comparison does the Coilhead justice. Sure, they essentially function in the same way, as Coilheads do not move while the player is looking at them. According to the bestiary, they were likely produced as biological weapons of war. In appearance, they look like a butchered mannequin, with many nails pierced into its legs and torso. Their arms are cut off at the elbow, and their head is connected to their body by a single spring. They have 2 soulless dots for eyes, and a gaping frown on their face. What sets them apart from the aforementioned SCP is their movement. When we turn away from them, we don't hear the dull grinding of a statue on concrete, but instead hear the small, rapid footsteps of it sprinting towards us, getting closer and closer until it removes our head from our body. When we stop them in their tracks by looking at them, the spring holding their head to their body swings, making a creaking noise that sounds like the hairs standing up on the back of your neck. They can be disabled for a short period of time with a stun grenade, but they will continue their pursuit shortly after. Coilheads are so dangerous because they force you to walk backwards, unaware of the dangers behind you. Additionally, they can block exits, and you are forced to look away from them in order to open the final exit door. Sure, you can have a single player stay put to keep the Coilhead in place, but that will leave them susceptible to the grasp of the next special enemy. Now, this next creature is responsible for the widespread phenomenon that is the 1000 quota stare, leaving employees of the lethal company traumatized for life without any hope of sick leave. What I am referring to is the Bracken, also known as the Flower Man. Picture this: you and your crew descend further into the bowels of the complex, only to be met with a long, black hallway. At the end, a pair of glowing yellow eyes. They hold your gaze for a moment, before disappearing around the corner. Desperate for loot, you trek further into the building, scanning the dark halls for loot and the unknown threat, with your friends doing the same. Suddenly, you turn to find that your fellow crew member is missing, with a blood trail left in his place. At the end of that blood trail, the same pair of glowing eyes that met you just moments before. The Flower Man is almost humanoid in shape, but it has some horrific spikes poking out from its torso that resemble a rib cage opened up all the way. It is reddish in colour, but will rarely let itself be seen in full light, instead stalking from the shadows. The bestiary confirms that it is leaves that are protruding from its torso, which is why it was named the Flower Man. But how does it work? It is easy to write how the Flower Man behaves in theory, but in the heat of the moment, its actions could vary. Basically, if you make eye contact with it from afar, you might be lucky enough to scare it away. Hold its gaze for too long, and you will enrage it, leading to its attack. This is not something that you can run from, as it will zip toward you at a speed so fast that it might as well be teleporting. After reaching you, it will snap your neck and drag you far away, leaving your bloody corpse in its favourite spot. Sometimes it will guard your body, other times it will begin stalking another player. They typically go after loners, and prey on those separated from the group. However, they have no problem attacking a player in a group if they have a staring problem. Your best bet for surviving is to look away a second or so after locking eyes with the Flower Man. If you can afford both a zap gun and a shovel, one player can stun it in place, while the other beats it to death, but this strategy costs hundreds of dollars, and these tools take up valuable inventory slots. It might be a stretch to call Flower Men unpredictable, but it would be an understatement to call them deadly. Most players would call the Bracken the most terrifying alien in Lethal Company's roster, but I would personally award that title to the next special enemy, the Jester. There is something so unnerving about its base appearance to me. A small jack-in-the-box, with human legs and a single human arm. This little guy will follow players around when on high-tier moons, and will eventually use that arm to begin winding itself up. What plays is an imperfect, sinister rendition of the song played by the toy that it based its appearance on. This perverse tune will increase in speed for 40 seconds, and as it reaches its climax, you will wish that you were simply jump-scared by a puppet. Instead, what emerges from the tiny box is an impossibly large skull, attached to the box by a gross, fleshy ligament. It begins charging towards the players. Its footsteps seem to get faster and faster until it catches and kills you. The only way to survive the Jester once it begins winding up the box is to leave the building and wait it out. Leaving the building is not always so simple, as you might be bogged down by weight, or disoriented, or facing other monsters. This process robs you of valuable looting time, and forces you to play carelessly for the remainder of the day. There's one final special enemy, which is one of the most effective tools in this multiplayer horror game. Let me set the scene. 4 players. You have all faced hoarding bugs, eyeless dogs, and even brackens, and have learnt to deal with them together as a team. You have screamed together and laughed together, enjoying the game simultaneously. But suddenly, despite being in a group, you are left totally alone. You hear some giggling behind you, and turn to your friends, asking if they heard it too, to no avail. You brush it off, scouring the complex even more, until you see it. See her. A little girl, laughing, dancing under a flickering light. You beg your friends to share your fear, but they have no idea what you are talking about. They walk right past the girl, blind to the threat that your eyes are open to. This is, of course, the Ghost Girl. She takes the form of a little girl in a red floral dress, though she has a skull for a face. This enemy appears to only one player in any given landing, and becomes their burden to carry. She will appear at various points, both inside and outside, tormenting the player that she chose to be her prey. It would honestly be better for her to just kill you the first time she sees you, but instead, she delays the inevitable, choosing instead to haunt you for some time. She is immune to all damage, with your only choice being to run. After haunting you, she will begin to skip toward you, indicating the beginning of a hunt. If she reaches you, you will be instantly decapitated. The Ghost Girl is incredibly rare, and she is impossible to scan, hence there is no bestiary entry. When choosing her prey, she makes the decision based on a variety of factors, including player paranoia, sanity, injury, and loot value. She is so effective at isolating a single player in a multiplayer game, leaving players to face their fears alone. Analyzing each of these enemies individually can help us better understand how they instill fear, but in practice, none of these enemies are on their own. To deal with them individually is possible, but survival becomes something that is almost unattainable as the enemies stack up against you. When you are fleeing from the charging thumper, you forget about the snare flea that you saw latch onto the ceiling minutes ago. As you sprint towards the ship with a forest keeper at your heels, avoiding the circuit bees becomes less of a priority. There are even instances where removing your gaze from the eyes of the Flower Man means looking away from the static coil head in front of you. The behaviour of a single monster is relatively predictable, but when they work together to keep you from returning to the ship alive, it becomes far more difficult to respond effectively. Moreover, time still adds pressure, with a limited number of hours in the day, intensifying the risk as the day progresses. There are countless combinations of enemies that I could continue to list off, which is multiplied by the fact that more than one of the same enemy type can spawn. What makes this more terrifying is the fact that much of the game is randomized. Everything from item placements, room layouts, and of course, enemy spawns. While we can use past experiences and the bestiary to adapt to each enemy, every time we land the ship on an alien moon, we are forced to grapple with the unknown. We can never predict what we will face in the heart of a moon's facility, and it is in this way that Lethal Company plays on the fear of the unknown. No two runs look the same. A strategy that worked in a previous run might get you killed in seconds in another. You can purchase yourself a zap gun, sure, but it might just plummet to the depths with you, because you weren't prepared to make a jump with the added weight. It is this uncertainty that helps sustain fear in multiple players for countless hours. I would be lying if I said that this fear doesn't eventually wane, but thankfully, this game is genuinely fun and hilarious. The dread you felt as your friend gets pulled into the abyss by a flower man will eventually turn into laughter, just as you will laugh at the sight of a player with a snare flea wrapped around their head. Games like GTFO and Phasmophobia can tend to take themselves too seriously, which makes it difficult for them to remain enjoyable after long periods of time. While the gameplay loop in Lethal Company is about as repetitive as can be, it is the random nature of each landing that makes it so replayable. Even though moments of fear are rare at this point, I still look forward to booting up the game, as I know that laughter will ensue. Congrats to the developer for creating a game that not only manages to scare people in a multiplayer game, but continues to be enjoyable once the shock wears off.